Hi, your EGYPTONERD here, and it's time for a Herstory lesson. History books are often filled with the lives and deeds of men, but in ancient Egypt there are also lots of significant women, one of the most famous of which being the female king Hatshepsut. But first let's talk about that term female king. Kingship is central to ancient Egyptian culture, and ideally, if not always in reality, Egypt should be ruled over by one king, or a king and their appointed co-regent. This role is conceptualized as masculine, though that doesn't necessarily mean that a woman couldn't occupy it, and there are several points in history where they did. Hatshepsut lived in the 18th dynasty in the early New Kingdom, and reigned roughly between 1473 and 1458 BC. She was the daughter of King Thutmose I and was the chief wife of Thutmose II. Thutmose II's reign was pretty short-lived, and he died when Thutmose III, a son by a secondary wife, was still too young to rule on his own. So there were about 7 years in which Hatshepsut ruled with him as a co-regent. Now, Hatshepsut seems to have been a very powerful figure even when Thutmose II was around, utilizing traditional queenly offices like the god's wife of Anu. Being the daughter of a king and his chief wife, and being a chief wife herself as well as a person of great influence, Hatshepsut may have seen herself as having a more legitimate claim to the throne than this child did. And so Hatshepsut asserted herself as king, taking on kingly titles and being represented wearing the crowns and regalia of the Pharaoh. In the early part of her reign, Hatshepsut is depicted as a woman but wearing the king's headdress, probably using as a model the late Middle Kingdom female ruler Sobekneferu. But eventually she comes to represent herself as fully male, complete with a beard, with her name and the female versions of traditional titles being the only clues to her gender. Hatshepsut's reign was a very successful one, with trade stretching from Minoan Crete all the way down to the land of Punt, possibly modern Eritrea. She also seems to have led a military expedition into Nubia, which is pretty badass. Hatshepsut's reign was an artistic high point of the early New Kingdom, when some of Egypt's most notable monuments were built. For example, her striking mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Hatshepsut seems to have been preparing her daughter Neferu-Ra to be heir to the throne, but upon Hatshepsut's death, the now adult Thutmose III comes back into centre stage, and sometime later begins to erase all trace that Hatshepsut was ever king. I'm sure some psychoanalysts might have a thing or two to say about that. The reception of Hatshepsut by modern audiences is almost as interesting as her life itself, with some seeing her as a ruthless, conniving woman, whilst others perhaps seeing her as a sort of proto-feminist icon. For me, I see her as an important figure in her own right, and certainly no more ruthless or self-serving than any other ruler of the time. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that certain attitudes towards Hatshepsut have little to do with her, and more to do with our attitudes towards gender roles and women in positions of power. That's all we've got time for, but be sure to subscribe, like and share, and I'll see you again next week. I'm your EGYPTONERD, and remember, there's always more to discover.